The idea for the Relationship School podcast started as a joke between two friends who realized they had learned more about love from mistakes than from any advice ever given to them. Neither of them had a perfect relationship history. In fact, that was the point. They were tired of podcasts where hosts spoke like experts who had everything figured out. What they wanted instead was a space where relationships were treated like a skill, something you learn, practice, fail at, and slowly get better at over time. No pretending. No gurus. Just real conversations about how people actually connect. The first episode was recorded in a small room with bad acoustics and cheap microphones. They talked about why no one teaches you how to argue without hurting each other, how to set boundaries without guilt, or how to recognize when love turns into control. They shared personal stories, breakups that dragged on too long, relationships that felt intense but empty, moments when silence did more damage than honesty. Listeners started responding almost immediately. Messages came in saying, "I thought I was the only one," or "No one ever explained it like this before." That's when they realized the podcast wasn't just content. It was filling a gap. Each episode felt like a lesson you should have had in school, but never did. How to communicate when you're angry without trying to win. How attraction isn't the same as compatibility. How love can be healthy and still end. They invited guests, not celebrities, but ordinary people with real stories. A couple who rebuilt trust after betrayal. A woman who learned to be alone after years of jumping between relationships. A man who admitted he didn't know how to express emotion until it cost him someone important. These weren't success stories. They were learning stories. What made the Relationship School podcast different was that it didn't offer formulas. It didn't promise forever or happiness. It focused on awareness, on asking better questions instead of giving perfect answers. Episodes often ended without clear conclusions because real relationships rarely wrap up neatly. Listeners were encouraged to reflect, not to fix themselves overnight, to understand patterns instead of judging them, to see relationships not as proof of worth, but as mirrors. Over time, the podcast became something people listened to on late-night walks, after arguments, during breakups, or while sitting alone wondering if they were doing love wrong. The hosts often said the same thing at the end of episodes. "You're not failing at relationships. You're learning." That sentence became the unofficial motto of the show. The Relationship School podcast never claimed to teach love. It taught responsibility, communication, and self-awareness. And maybe that was the real lesson, that relationships don't need perfect people. They need honest ones. And if school never taught us how to love, maybe learning together, out loud, one conversation at a time, was the next best thing. As the podcast grew, so did the responsibility they felt toward the people listening. Messages became longer, more vulnerable. Some listeners shared voice notes about arguments they didn't know how to repair. Others wrote about leaving relationships that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty inside. The hosts stopped seeing the podcast as something they made and started seeing it as something they were part of. Every episode was no longer just a conversation between two voices in a room, but a reflection of thousands of quiet experiences happening at the same time, in different cities, different lives. They introduced a new segment called Homework, a small idea that quickly became a favorite. It wasn't advice or rules. It was reflection. Simple questions like, what are you avoiding saying because you're afraid of conflict? Or are you choosing comfort or honesty right now? Listeners were invited to sit with the question for a week, not to fix anything, just to notice. The feedback was powerful. People wrote back saying the question stayed with them during conversations, during silence, during moments when they usually reacted without thinking. The podcast wasn't changing relationships directly. It was changing awareness, and that changed everything else naturally. With time, the hosts also became more honest about their own ongoing struggles. They talked openly about relationships that still confused them, about moments when they failed to live up to their own words. That transparency mattered. It reminded listeners that learning doesn't end when you understand something once. It's a continuous process, especially when emotions are involved. Love, they said, isn't about reaching a final level. It's about staying curious instead of defensive, present instead of perfect. The podcast began to feel like a shared classroom without hierarchy. No teachers above students. Just people at different points in the same lesson. Some were learning how to love others better. Some were learning how to stop abandoning themselves. Some were learning that being alone wasn't a failure, but a phase of growth. And every story mattered, even the unfinished ones. In one of the most listened to episodes, they said something simple that stayed with many listeners. Healthy relationships don't come from finding the right person. They come from becoming a more honest one. That line spread quietly, shared in messages, written in notebooks, repeated in moments of doubt. It didn't promise certainty or safety. It promised clarity. The Relationship School podcast never became about answers. It became about permission, permission to question, to slow down, to unlearn what no longer worked. And in a world that constantly tells people how love should look, that permission turned out to be the most valuable lesson of all.